Hi, friends. Pastor Zach here, and I'm in my fourth part of the Golden Rule series of based on John 13:34 of this 10-part series I'm doing. I'm kind of giving some brief summaries of my messages along the way. And so John 13:34 says, "A new commandment I give to you," Jesus says, "love one another, even as I have loved you, so love one another." And in my in-depth study of this passage of John 13:34, I'm taken to two passages, Leviticus 19:18 and Deuteronomy 6:5. I'm going to focus on Leviticus 19:18 for now, and I'm going to address Deuteronomy later. But it's basically a fulfillment where Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as himself. On these hang all the law and the prophets. But John 13:34 seems to be directly quoting Leviticus 19:18, which says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Here's what's fascinating about Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19 is literally repeating and enlarging or zooming in and zooming out on the 10 commandments of Exodus 20. If you read Leviticus 19, it reads like Exodus 20, only it seems to be that God is adding additional commandments to the old ones that he originally already gave. And what's more mind blowing is in John 13:34, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you." And it's like, whoa, are God and Jesus giving new commandments? No, here's what I believe they are doing. They're simply prescribing or describing or elaborating on what it meant in Exodus 20. It's expounding on how we are to practically be keeping God's commandments. What does it look like? And so God kind of expounds on them. And you should do a study. Read through Exodus 20, read through the 10 Commandments, and then do yourself a favor and go through Leviticus 19, start in verse 1 and read all the way down to at least verse 29 of Leviticus 19. And you'll see these cool similarities. But here's where it gets more interesting. The first four commandments that have to do with God, right? Do not have any other gods, do make any graven image, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Those are all pretty much normal. But when we get to the last six commandments that have to do with how we treat each other, God elaborates extensively on some of them. But one of the most interesting ones that I want to briefly talk about is commandment number 8: you shall not steal. And that's how it reads in Exodus 20, verse 15. But in Leviticus 19, 11, and 13, it says something interesting. It says, "You shall not steal, and you shall not oppress your neighbor or even rob him." It's interesting that oppression is tied with robbing and stealing, and it kind of adds a little bit there. But I think this is where it gets more interesting. I think this is where it gets more interesting with the eighth commandment. Before Leviticus 19:11 and the command to not steal, God in verses 9 through 10 sets a prerequisite to the commandment. It says in verse 9, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard, you shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner, for I am the Lord your God." Here's what's fascinating about this passage. It's like, who is this commandment really for? Is the commandment to not steal for the rich who have plenty, or the poor who have nothing? And the answer, of course, is both. Those who have plenty are responsible for providing enough resources for those who are poor, so that way the poor don't have to break the commandments. It's not God just saying, "Hey, even if you're poor, don't break them." It's, "Hey, if you're rich, it's almost like you're supposed to provide enough resources so people are not without and have to break the commandments." So it's really interesting. Those who have then are just as guilty of stealing from the poor if they are not letting them take from the abundance of what God has already given to them. So it's possible then for both to be guilty of stealing, the one who doesn't give but has, and the one who doesn't have but takes. Stealing then has more to do with just taking something from our neighbor, but it has to do how we treat our neighbor based upon how God has treated us. What does it say in John 13:34? Love one another just as I have loved you. So, I think it's really interesting that God is enlarging on this idea, expanding on this idea of what it means to love one another. And a core basis of that is really understanding the ways in which God has loved us. So, my challenge is this: to creatively think about how God has provided for us, how God has cared for us, how God has loved us, and to ask ourselves, how can we care for others in those similar ways? Because maybe in those areas of our lives where God has loved us, there is a creative opportunity for us to be able to love other people in those same ways. I was meeting with a young adult and talking with him one time, and I kind of shared this idea that oftentimes in our greatest pain, God brings out our greatest purpose. In our greatest of pain, or in the deepest of pain we've experienced, I've often found that God uses our pain and turns it into a reason or an opportunity for his purpose. So let's think about that. What are the ways in which God has significantly provided in our lives? And maybe we can ask ourselves, is there an opportunity there for us to give back from what God has given us to provide for the lives of others? Be blessed, friends.